It was cold because it was January of 1970 in New Jersey. The 30-year-old mathematical and philosophical prodigy named Saul Kripke was invited to Princeton, New Jersey to give a series of lectures to the philosophy department. They were titled Naming and Necessity. In these 3 lectures, which would later be published as a book, Kripke attacked the dominant theory of proper names. Proper names are expressions like Abraham Lincoln. That's some guy's name. We capitalize proper names in English. The dominant theory that Kripke was attacking is descriptivism. Really, that's a broad category of theories, and the most famous or prominent version at the time had been introduced 12 years earlier in 1958 by John Searle. Searle's version was called the cluster theory because it involved a group or a cluster of descriptions. The main thing to understand for now is this. Abraham Lincoln is a guy, and we could describe him. We could say that he was the 16th president of the United States. I think he was the 16th president. I'm not going to look it up. I'm just going to say it, and maybe I'll be wrong. Descriptivism is the idea that proper names like Abraham Lincoln are really just synonymous. They really have the same meaning as descriptions like the 16th president of the United States. Searle noticed a problem with the theory that this just means the same thing as this. The problem is that Abraham Lincoln could have actually lost the election of 1860. He wouldn't be the 16th president of the United States, but he would still be Abraham Lincoln. So this doesn't mean the same thing as this. Searle's solution to this was to say that associated with this name, there's a whole cluster, a whole group of descriptions like this, and Abraham Lincoln, the name, just refers to whichever guy matches or fits enough of these descriptions. Searle introduced this theory in 1958. Everyone in philosophy was like, oh, Searle, you're a genius, your theory's correct. And then Kripke attacks it, destroys the theory in this famous series of lectures. We are talking about lecture number 2. Here we go. Kripke begins this lecture by reformulating Searle's theory into 6 theses, and here's my paraphrase of those theses. 1. Names have associated properties. The idea here is just that when you hear a name like Abraham Lincoln, a bunch of properties or descriptions or whatever pop into your head. The 16th president of the United States and the issuer of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was the executive order signed by Abraham Lincoln that freed the slaves. That's probably like the most famous thing about him, right? Is that he freed the slaves, and this is how he did it. So this first claim in Kripke's reformulation of Searle's theory is just that proper names like Abraham Lincoln have these properties or these descriptions. A description is just a way of expressing a property, something about an object. These descriptions, these properties are associated in people's minds with the name. 2, the properties uniquely identify something. There are some properties that are shared by lots of people. For example, being the former president of the United States is a property had by like 40-something people, right? Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and Taft. There's also Taft. He's got that property. But the properties that are associated with the name, so goes Searle's theory, are enough to pick out one and only one person uniquely. These properties, maybe enough of them taken together, pick out just one guy. He's the only one that satisfies them, Abraham Lincoln. 3, the unique object with the weighted majority of the properties is the referent. Thesis number 3 is really the heart of Searle's cluster theory. When Kripke says weighted majority, he's getting onto the idea that some of these properties might be more important than others, and so they get more weight or something like that. It's all very vague and amorphous, and that's fine. The point is just whichever thing fits with enough of these, that is the referent of the name. That guy, whoever meets enough of these characteristics, that's Abraham Lincoln. 4, if nothing satisfies enough properties, then the name does not refer. If it turns out that there isn't something out there that has enough of these properties, well then the name Abraham Lincoln doesn't refer to anyone. It's sort of an empty name. In the same way that the name Harry Potter is an empty name, there's no boy out there who meets enough of those descriptions. There's no boy who has a lightning tattoo and magic powers and killed Voldemort. Did I ruin the book? He kills Voldemort. Anyway, he doesn't exist. The name Harry Potter refers to no one because there's no one out there that meets enough of these descriptions, and so the idea is If there was no one out there that met enough of these descriptions, there would be no referent of the name Abraham Lincoln. There would be no Abraham Lincoln. 5. It is a priori that the referent has these properties. Okay, this one's a little complicated, but it's worth explaining clearly because it's going to be important. A priori means knowable prior to experience. You can know an a priori fact just by thinking clearly about what's going on. You don't have to go out into the world and do surveys or experiments or look anywhere with your senses, your eyes and your ears, or whatever. Now, why would this be a result of Searle's descriptivist theory? Well, on these descriptivist theories, at least as Kripke construes them, proper names are just synonymous. They have the same meaning as some descriptions. And statements that are true by definition can be known a priori. Here's an example. The word grandmother, just by definition, means the mother of a parent. So the statement that grandmothers are mothers of parents is true by definition. Like, you don't have to go out in the world and experience things in order to figure that out. You just have to know the meaning of the word. You can know that that's true a priori. The idea is supposed to be that if the name Abraham Lincoln just means, by definition, the person who was the 16th president of the United States and who issued the Emancipation Proclamation, if that's the meaning of the proper name, just in the same way that the meaning of grandmother is mother of a parent, then you should be able to know that Abraham Lincoln did these things a priori. 6. It is necessary that the referent has these properties. The explanation here is similar, but in order to make sense of it, I have to explain what philosophers mean when they say necessary. The key point is that truths, true statements, are not all created equal. Consider the sentence, Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860. That sentence is true, but it just happened by chance to be true. Lincoln only got the Republican nomination for president on like the 3rd ballot. He didn't win the 1st ballot or the 2nd ballot. They kept having to do more ballots or whatever. I don't really know how it works. And then he finally got it on the 3rd ballot. Things could have gone differently. He may have not been the Republican nominee, or even if he was the nominee, he may have lost the election if things had gone slightly differently. And so we say that even though this is true, it's only true contingently, or by chance. Compare that with this. The winner of the election of 1860 won the election of 1860. This sentence is also true, but it's not true contingently. It's not just true by chance. It has to be true. No matter how history played out, whoever won the election of 1860, they won the election of 1860. So this truth is true necessarily. That's how we get thesis 6 as part of Searle's cluster theory. If the name Abraham Lincoln is just synonymous with, it just has the same meaning as the expression the 16th president of the United States, then this sentence, it turns out, has to be necessarily true, because Abraham Lincoln is just defined as the winner of the election of 1860. So the winner of the election of 1860 won the election of 1860. Yeah, that's true, and it's necessarily true. Once you understand thesis 6 as part of Kripke's statement of Searle's theory, you realize, oh, Searle's theory is wrong. At least thesis 6 is wrong, because it's not true that this is necessary. This is contingent. So that's the end of thesis 6. What's going to happen in the rest of this lecture, lecture 2 of naming and necessity that we're talking about today, is that Kripke is going to go through all the rest of these theses and prove that each one of them is false, except for one. Number 1 is correct, Kripke thinks. Like, it's just true that there is an associated cluster of properties that go along with proper names, like Abraham Lincoln. Like, that's just true. What's controversial and what Kripke is going to attack about Searle's theory is that that cluster of properties, or that cluster of descriptions, makes up the meaning of the proper name. That's the thing that he's going to attack. So he's going to now attack, in addition to thesis 6, he's going to attack theses 2, 3, 4, and 5. Oh no, in order to really understand this, you have to know what a rigid designator is, and you have to understand possible worlds. So I'm just going to refer you to another video that I'm going to make explaining that. So if you haven't watched my video about possible worlds and rigid designators, Go watch that right now. Okay, are you back? Now we can sort of complete the attack that Kripke makes against Thesis 6. It would seem that it's a contingent fact that Aristotle ever did any of the things commonly attributed to him today, any of these great achievements that we so much admire. Kripke's point is just that associated with the name Aristotle, there's a whole cluster of descriptions, but it's not necessary that Aristotle did any of that stuff. It could have been that Aristotle never showed up to Plato's academy, he never learned from Plato, he never did any of the stuff, he never wrote any of the books, he could have just been like a ditch digger. That's possible. If so, then it's not necessarily true, though it is actually true, it's not necessarily true that Aristotle did all that stuff. This is an attack on Thesis 6. Here, I'll rerun it with Abraham Lincoln. It's not necessarily true that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th President of the United States, the issuer of the Emancipation Proclamation, the writer and speaker of the Gettysburg Address. All of this stuff that we associate with Abraham Lincoln, it's not necessary that he did any of that stuff. Maybe he just stayed in Kentucky where he was born. He was like born in a log cabin, they say, or whatever. Maybe he just stayed there and lived out his life in Kentucky and never became a politician or anything like that. That's possible. It's not necessary that he did any of that stuff. So, Thesis 6 is false. And Kripke's point is that a proper name like Abraham Lincoln is a rigid designator because it continues to designate, it continues to refer to the same guy, Abraham Lincoln, even in those other possible worlds, in those other possibilities where he never goes into politics, never becomes the president, never does any of that stuff. Okay, we're ready to move on to Thesis 2. Thesis 2, as you remember, is just the idea that these descriptions, which are associated with the name, are enough to uniquely identify the one guy, and him alone, Abraham Lincoln. Kripke attacks this by saying the following. For example, Cicero was the man who denounced Catiline. The average person, according to this, by this he means Searle's theory and specifically Thesis 2, when he refers to Cicero, is saying something like the man who denounced Catiline, and thus has picked out a certain man uniquely. In fact, most people, when they think of Cicero, just think of a famous Roman orator, without any pretension to think either that there is only one famous Roman orator, or that one must know something else about Cicero to have a referent for the name. So Cicero was like a famous Roman orator, and people can meaningfully use the name Cicero to refer to Cicero, even though their cluster of descriptions, their cluster of properties that pop into their head is not enough to uniquely identify anyone. All they've got in their head when they hear the name Cicero and when they use that name is some famous Roman guy or whatever. But there were lots of famous Roman guys. That's not a unique description. Consider Richard Feynman, to whom many of us are able to refer. He is a leading contemporary theoretical physicist. Feynman is dead now, I think, but he was a big shot. He won the Nobel Prize in physics or whatever. He was a famous big deal physicist. And he had this proper name. The name was Richard Feynman, and people could use that name to talk about him, to refer to him. Everyone here, I'm sure, can state the contents of one of Feynman's theories so as to differentiate him from Gell-Mann. Okay, this is sarcasm, right? He's joking that like, oh, you, these philosophers in this audience in 1970, surely you know enough physics to just state one of Feynman's theories with such precision that that statement, that description, those properties of Feynman differentiate Feynman from like some other famous physicist, maybe named Gell-Mann. However, the man in the street, not possessing these abilities, may still use the name Feynman. When asked, he will say, well, he's a physicist or something. He may not think that this picks out anyone uniquely. I still think he uses the name Feynman as a name for Feynman. The point is just that Thesis 2 is false. The descriptions that people have in their heads that they associate with proper names that they can use in the normal way meaningfully to refer to people, those descriptions, that cluster of properties, it's not enough to uniquely pick out some object in the world. At least often it's not. Moving on to Thesis 3, this is the most important central thesis in Searle's theory. The unique object with the weighted majority of the properties is the referent. Whichever thing has enough of these properties, that thing is Abraham Lincoln. Kripke attacks this with a famous fictional story, a made-up example that he gives, which is called the Gödel-Schmidt case. To understand this, you have to know who Kurt Gödel was. He was an absolutely dominant mathematician and philosopher, and he proved that there are certain truths of arithmetic that themselves can never be proven. The name for this thing that he proved is the incompleteness of arithmetic. It's a very big deal. You don't have to know what it is. You just have to know, whoa, that's really good. You're really good at math and logic and whatever, Gödel. Imagine the following blatantly fictional situation. I hope that Professor Gödel is not present. Okay, that sounds like a joke, but I don't think it's a joke, right? So this super famous mathematician, Kurt Gödel, Kripke is giving this lecture in 1970 in Princeton, and he's saying like, I'm gonna make up this story about Gödel. I hope Gödel's not here in the audience today. Sounds like a joke, but I actually don't think it necessarily was a joke because like Gödel lived in Princeton at the end of his life and he didn't die until 1972, and Gödel was very interested in philosophy, so it's not crazy that in 1970 Gödel might have just gone to a philosophy lecture being given at Princeton. It's not unreasonable to think that he might have been in the audience. Anyway, here we go. Suppose that Gödel was not in fact the author of this theorem. The theorem is the incompleteness of arithmetic. A man named Schmidt, whose body was found in Vienna under mysterious circumstances many years ago, actually did the work in question. His friend Gödel somehow got hold of the manuscript, and it was thereafter attributed to Gödel. Okay, so we're imagining a scenario where Gödel murders his friend Schmidt and then steals the credit for this brilliant mathematical discovery or whatever. That's the scenario we're considering, and it's a scenario, think about it, on which Gödel no longer has the property mainly associated with Gödel. This is a situation where Gödel didn't actually do the thing. He didn't actually prove the incompleteness of arithmetic. He just stole the credit for it, or whatever. On the view in question then, when our ordinary man uses the name Gödel, he really means to refer to Schmidt, because Schmidt is the unique person satisfying the description, the man who discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic. According to thesis 3, which is what Kripke is attacking, the name Gödel in this scenario would refer to Schmidt, because Schmidt is the one who meets the description or meets enough of the cluster of descriptions or whatever. But Kripke's thought is that that's bonkers. That's wrong. If it turns out that Schmidt is really the one who proved the incompleteness of arithmetic, then when we talk about Gödel, we're still talking about Gödel. The way that we even express this scenario, the way that we describe it is we say, Gödel really didn't discover the incompleteness of arithmetic, Gödel murdered Schmidt, all this stuff. We're using the name Gödel to refer here not to Schmidt, the guy who fits the descriptions, the guy who has the properties. No, we're using the name Gödel to refer to Gödel. So since the man who discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic is in fact Schmidt, we, when we talk about Gödel, are in fact always referring to Schmidt. But it seems to me that we are not. We simply are not. In this fictional scenario, it's just wrong to say that the name Gödel now refers to Schmidt. So thesis 3 is false. If Kripke is right about this, then this name cannot be synonymous with all of these descriptions or a cluster of them or any of that. That's the rejection of thesis 3. It's not true that whoever meets all of these descriptions just is the referent. Thesis 4, you'll remember, is just the idea that if no one meets all or enough of these descriptions, then the name doesn't refer to anyone. If nothing satisfies enough properties, then the name does not refer. Kripke attacks this thesis by just tweaking the Gödel-Schmidt case. Suppose, to vary the example about Gödel, no one had discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic. Perhaps the proof simply materialized by a random scattering of atoms on a piece of paper. Even if the conditions are not satisfied by a unique object, the name may still refer. Right, so this is an imagined case where no one has the property of being the first person to prove the incompleteness of arithmetic, because just by a chance of nature, somehow some atoms arranged themselves on a piece of paper in the shape of this proof, and Gödel read it. So no one really proved it. He just read it off the thing, and he's like, whoa, this is true. In that scenario, the name Gödel still refers to Gödel. It doesn't refer to no one. 5. It is a priori that the referent has these properties. Kripke's going to attack this too. And remember why this was part of Searle's theory, right? If it turns out that names are just synonymous with, they just have the same definition as some description or some cluster of descriptions, then it's knowable without experience. You can just know it by thinking clearly about the definitions of the words. You can know that, for example, Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860. But Kripke's point is that, no, you can't know that a priori. The only way you know this is by doing history. He similarly makes the point with Gödel. He says that, look, this Gödel-Schmidt case that I gave, where Gödel doesn't fit the descriptions. Gödel doesn't have the property of having, proved the incompleteness of arithmetic. That Gödel-Schmidt case is false. It's fictional. But you can't figure out that it's fictional a priori without experiencing the world. In order to prove that Kripke made up that story, you'd have to gather physical evidence, observe the world, go out into the world. So thesis 5 is false as well. Kripke does concede, however, that there are some proper names that are used in a weird way. They're not like normal proper names, and in these cases, Searle's theory is probably correct. One example that Kripke gives to illustrate this is Jack the Ripper. So I have to explain some history of London in the 1800s or whatever. In some year, which I'm now going to look up while I'm editing this video, there was a murderer murdering people in London. So the police would discover these bodies of people who had been viciously murdered. And there were multiple murders, and they all looked similar. And so the police came up with a theory, and the theory was, oh, it's the same dude. There's some guy out there, or some person, who's doing all of these murders. All of these murders were done by the same person. That's the theory. And the newspaper editors made up a name for whoever it is. They don't know who it is yet, and they never figured out who it is, I don't think. They made up a name for whoever was killing all these people, and that name was Jack the Ripper. And so the newspapers would run headlines like Jack Strikes Again or something like that. Now this is an unusual proper name. Normally with proper names, we give the name to the thing, like a person. In the case of a person, a proper name for a person, we give that person the name when they're a baby or whatever. We can see them, we know which person we're talking about, and we say, oh, look at this baby, we're gonna call him Abraham Lincoln. That's what Lincoln's parents said or whatever. But in the case of Jack the Ripper, the name is introduced at a time when no one knows who the referent is. The name is sort of like a theoretical term. There's this theory that there's a serial killer out there, one person who killed all these different people. And according to that theory, there's some entity out in the world that meets a whole bunch of descriptions. Murdered this person on this day, murdered this person on this day, this person on this day. So Kripke just grants that there's some unusual cases of proper names where that proper name fits the cluster theory. This name refers to just whoever meets most of the descriptions. And if no one meets most of these descriptions, if it turns out that, the theory is false and that these murders were committed by all different people, then it turns out that this name refers to no one, that there is no Jack the Ripper. It's just a bunch of individual murderers, not one serial killer. Kripke's point, though, is just that this is an unusual case. In the vast majority of cases of proper names like Abraham Lincoln, or Aristotle, or Cicero, or North Carolina, or Mount Everest, in all of these normal cases, the proper name doesn't fit the cluster theory.
Hi, it's me, in my office. If you have a long enough attention span to make it this far in the video, then you might be interested in the book that I'm writing. If you click the link in the description below and put in your email address, I will email you when the book is ready. I promise I will not send you a million emails. I will not sell your email address to spammers. All you will get is an email from me when the book is for sale. And I will pick a bunch of those emails, and those people will get free copies of the book.